If weapons are stored anywhere inside the Gaza Strip, Hamas will raid those stores at a time of its choosing. And any force that constitutes the stabilisation force or the verification committee or anybody else will flee.
To have the peace board sit down with Israel's leadership and to reiterate that there will be absolutely no withdrawal of IDF forces until these conditions are met, a complete decommission of all light, heavy, all promising.
This disarmament plan really appears to have been written by a 6-year-old inhabitant of Candyland, where unicorns and fairies are the only inhabitants of the area around. It is completely and utterly detached from reality. Welcome everybody to this episode of the Benjamin Anthony Show, a product of the MirYam Institute, and I'm delighted as ever to be joined by our in-house analyst, John Spencer, an individual who is a prolific publisher of academic papers and analysis on all things military, in no small part focusing upon Israel and our multi-front war against terror proxies arrayed throughout and along our borders and elsewhere. He's just back from a trip into the Gaza Strip where he was on a fact-finding mission as well as in southern Lebanon. It's a real pleasure to have you with us, John. I'm going to dive straight in, but before I do, just tell me, how are you doing?
I'm good. Living with jet lag is pretty much what I do day to day. So life is good. I had an amazing visit and happy to be with you again.
Yeah, we're very pleased to have you back. So, John, I want to focus not on Iran. And the reason for that is because, just to declare my hand, I have long ago given up on the importance that is attached to tweets coming from the President of the United States with regard to Iran. This is me saying this in my name. It's not you saying this in your name or on behalf of anybody else. I would encourage other people to, again, distance the notion of importance from these tweets. I think that the madman theory, where one ratchets up and ratchets up and ratchets up the rhetoric, has long since played itself out. I don't think it's effective at all. And quite frankly, I don't think that the story has substantially moved on. And therefore, I don't want that to be the focus of this conversation. I want to talk much more, for the purpose of today, about the disarmament plan and the agreement that actually, despite what I've just said, was announced as an end to the conflict between Hamas and Israel via a tweet by the same President of the United States. But it's a different subject, it's a different area, and it definitely warrants our time and our attention on that. So, John, just briefly, why don't you take some of the military aspects of the merits and demerits, if you want to begin, of this latest agreement/proposal?
Sure. Well, thank you. And again, such a great visit I had on my 8th trip into Israel, 7th trip into Gaza. I've been to every location really that you can imagine with the IDF in the Gaza Strip. I did see, while I was on the ground, the border peace variations of the post. So I would, as we have in the past, whether it was with the memorandum of understanding or the 20-point peace plan, actually, I would recommend going back, reading the 20-point peace plan, and then reading this latest announcement by the Board of Peace on what is agreed upon after, which I'm sure, long deliberations between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UAE, and Hamas, who I actually don't think should have a voice, but it is what it is, and there are many reasons for the situation we find ourselves. Now, if I go to what was posted about this agreement that was celebrated by the Board of Peace and others, and the United States administration, I believe rightfully so, as we understand with all the other fronts, and if we had time to talk about southern Lebanon and the immense challenges, but also progress, but Iran, that this has continued just by the fact that the conversation has continued, I think is a positive. If we look for the positives, like as you told me, and the negatives, I think the positive is an acknowledgement that status quo, just leaving it with Israel on one, on the yellow line, with a buffer zone, which I believe is important between not just the IDF and the yellow zone, but the area behind the IDF. It's almost a new border security concept of having this hold the line aspect. And many of the places I visited in the current situation are these very secure buffer areas. The fact that this conversation has continued and that the status quo isn't the future, I think, is a positive. Now, other things in there is, which I think was the biggest thing of the 20-point plan that I agreed with. Unlike all of the history before, is that says that it is conditions based. Even the agreement that was posted by the Peace Board says condition and verified, and they actually mention a new organization, the International Verification Committee. So that's of course, I don't trust Hamas, and we're going to talk about how wording and what Hamas has said about the plan and what they agreed to. Um, I want somebody to verify conditions-based progress, which is in this agreement. The other thing that I agree with, because I know of how much is a challenge, it talks about the NCAG and whether we agree on who's selected. It talks about the budget. And I believe that is one of the reasons that there hasn't been more progress. It actually talks about which having Saudi Arabia and UAE, like who's going to fund this? If these countries were so adamant about the path forward, then you pony up some money. So it talks about a $400 million budget for contracts. And that's, of course, one of the biggest things that I saw that sits with you is just the rubble from this most intensive urban combat that anybody's seen in generation. At the fall of Hamas, that amount of rubble to get to anything other than the status quo has to be contracted, cleared, tunnels filled, all of that part of the board. Now, of course, the most important part of the plan that we will, I'm sure, discuss is the negatives and the positives about decommissioning Hamas's weapons. And the variation of the Peace Board written document that was posted talks about decommissioning, phased decommissioning, warehousing of, and everybody attacked that. I'm glad that at the time we're talking, the Peace Board met with Israel, and I understand actually why I would want Israel voices and Israel security concerns a large part of the conversation. But if you're dealing with some of these organizations, they want to have negotiations outside of that. I understand that. But to have the Peace Board sit down, the head of the Peace Board, with Israel's leadership and say, this is what it says, this is what it means, and to reiterate that there will be absolutely no withdrawal of IDF forces until these conditions are met, a complete decommission of all light, heavy, and they add weapons into tunnels as part of decommissioning, all promising. Of course, if I want to cast doubt on the plan, is that we're dealing with terrorists who have publicly said since the Peace Board posted this that, oh, we didn't say this, which is the rhetoric, Benjamin, that we understand, right? The rhetoric of them saying stuff, and I care about actions on the ground. I care about Israel's security. I care about the forward progress of you have to decommission first, and then you have to start clearing rubble, and you have to fill the tunnels, and then you have to start de-radicalization for any hope on what is going to be the realistic path forward. That this is forward progress. We all disagreed with what it was saying about weapons, and that there was light between Hamas keeping weapons and keeping them in the Gaza Strip. The Peace Board, after meeting with Israel, has seconded that complete decommissioning of weapons. Only people, and they actually say we're moving the rule of the gun, basically rule by gun to rule by civil governance, the NCAG. So to be, I will be the optimist. I'm sure, Benjamin, you'll be the contrarian pragmatist. Because of the situation and Israel not occupying the Gaza Strip, period, the fact that this model is a very controversial but actual forward progress of having civil governance, having an international stabilization force, which is mentioned in this, to be the police. It actually says that, which I love, because everybody didn't know what will be the mission of the stabilization force, that they will police along with Palestinian whatever, which is exactly what I, with the history of this, would want to see. I don't trust anybody. I trust but verify. And I would want a international representative side by side with whatever's being created to verify, not give ownership like a failed Unifil project, but actually to be there every day and verifying weapons buyback, decommissioning, clearing areas, and policing. So I see positives, Benjamin, and I know that there are the negatives on interpretations in what was written. I actually understand what was written isn't actually what's going to happen. And this is unfortunately the way that mediation between terrorists works, where they want to see something in writing. We understand that's not what it actually means. They then say publicly that it means even more than what it says. And we get to this. I really don't care. I want to see actions on the ground, which is that conditions based progress.
Okay, so thank you, John, and I'm grateful for your optimism. I'm going to, as you predicted, counterpoint
Yeah.
in a number of ways. And I do so, of course, as somebody who lives in Israel, served inside the Gaza Strip, has seen this cycle of violence that's somewhat referenced obliquely within the agreement, return upon itself and return upon itself. And all of these partial resolutions to these conflicts, in my opinion, resulted in the total and complete catastrophe of October the 7th. And so there needs to be some sort of outcome here that brings a complete end to the threat posed by Hamas and by other militant groups inside the Gaza Strip to Israeli citizens. And surprise, surprise, this agreement that does not do. Firstly, overarchingly, the biggest problem that I have with this is that we have seen from previous rounds of negotiations that the next series of negotiators come to the table under the auspices typically of the United States of America, but also there can be some other international agitators, such as France, for example. And the starting point for negotiations begin at the end point of the previous round. This end point of the previous round, which leaves an opening, for example, for not destroying weapons, at least in written form, but rather storing them, decommissioning them, that is going to be open for interpretation in a future round of discussions. I guarantee it. Secondly, I am very disappointed that there is this continuing tendency to put forward, with great boast and bluster, rapidly, hurriedly, inefficiently cobbled together agreements that really have no substance to them whatsoever, and most unfortunately take place in the absence of the state of Israel around the negotiating table. We have seen that with regard to Iran, where negotiations took place in Pakistan, a country that doesn't even recognize the state of Israel, under the auspices of a vice president who has voiced what I'm going to go ahead and say are deeply anti-Semitic tropes with regard to Israel undermining and destroying his fool's errand of going and negotiating with the Iranians in the first place. During his interview, J.D. Vance's interview on Joe Rogan's podcast, as his memorandum of misunderstanding, as our colleague Yaakov Lapin called it, when that memorandum of misunderstanding fell apart, as it was almost guaranteed to do, J.D. Vance went and said, well, that's of course because of Israel. And I, as a Jew, take that not as a dog whistle, as an explicitly anti-Semitic statement, whether by design or unintended consequence. I'll leave the listener to form their own opinion. So we've had this negotiation about Israel's future in Israel's absence, both around Iran and now with regard to the Gaza Strip. And reading through this memorandum, John, it strikes me that this disarmament plan really appears to have been written by a 6-year-old inhabitant of Candyland, where unicorns and fairies are the only inhabitants of the area around that individual, and where there are no real problems whatsoever. It is completely and utterly detached from reality. And I want to give a couple of points, and then we can have a back and forth about it. And as you predicted, and as I said at the beginning of my response, I'm very, very pessimistic about the virtue of any of this. First of all, within this agreement is a call for the self-determination and statehood, presumably, although it doesn't actually say so, of the Palestinian Arabs. I oppose that. I think that any people, and it was the people, as well as the Nukhba forces, as well as the Hamas forces, as well as Palestinian Islamic Jihad, it was also Gazan civilians, any people who behaved the way that they did on October 7th and in various public rounds of events such as hostage releases subsequent to October 7th, that people is disqualified from statehood. Disqualified from statehood. They are not deserving of a state. The international community should not provide them with the means and methods of having a state, and the state of Israel should never permit what is very likely to become a failed terror state to be established on our borders, whether inside Gaza or inside Judea and Samaria. So the suggestion that all of this should culminate in self-determination and statehood for the Palestinian Arabs fills me with horror and with dread. Now, politically, thankfully, I don't believe, John, there's any Israeli leader now or any Israeli politician, and obviously Israel's right in the throes of election season with those elections taking place on October 27th of this year. No leader in the Israeli political sphere can advocate for the establishment of a Palestinian state at this time. Rightly so, long may that continue. So this is completely detached from reality politically as well within Israel. The last couple of things that I'm going to mention are, it again, John, and I don't mean any offense to you as an American, because I realize this is part of the American lexicon, right? But it again is replete with this endless stream of completely substance-free acronyms that to me mean less than nothing. I'll give you just a rattling off of a few of those. The International Verification Committee that you just mentioned, it has an acronym, the IVC. What is the IVC? What will that look like? We have no idea, but we're expected as Israelis to trust it. It includes, incidentally, that verification committee, representatives from Qatar and from Turkey. Maybe they will be present, maybe they won't in the ultimate standing up of this apparition, but that is the case at the moment. In addition to that, we've of course got the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the NCAG, something else we don't really know what it means. The Board of Peace, that one's appropriately abbreviated to BOP, B-O-P, the Board of Peace, and the International Stabilisation Force, the ISF. Now, this endless stream of nonsensical and completely unproven acronyms that are supposed to suggest some sort of security for the Israeli people, these all should be dismissed on their face. And the reason is, if the Israeli people saw the complete failure of the Israel Defense Forces on October 7th, and we did, tragically we did, the fight back was something to behold. But the horrors of October 7th constituted a terrible failure on our part. Don't expect us for a moment to take trust which has been shaken in our own defense forces and bequeath that unto forces that hitherto do not actually even exist, such as that word salad of acronyms that I just mentioned. Two last points about specific clauses, John. It says in clause 6 of this agreement that Gaza, I'm quoting here, shall be governed according to the principle of one authority, one law, one weapon. You mentioned that in your opening comments. John, I know places in the United States, and I know places in Israel, and I know places in Britain where we haven't brought about this utopia of the principle, the implementation of the principle of one authority, one law, one weapon. We see gangland killings all over the place. We see mobland killings all over the place. The idea that we could somehow bring a perfect peace under this rubric to the Gaza Strip, which is host to perhaps the most radicalized people on the face of the earth, to me is truly the stuff of fantasy. And I don't know why I'm expected to put any faith into that notion at all. With regard to the police force that you spoke about, you know, and I know, that prior to Hamas taking power, the Palestinian Authority was in charge. And the Palestinian Authority inside Gaza was kneecapped, bullets were fired into the back of their heads, and they were thrown off the top of buildings. I don't think that a police force armed with tasers and truncheons and even light weapons is going to be able to stand up to the murderous ambitions of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or any other evolution of those organizations. And the final clause I want to get into is clause number 8, John. Of course, feel free to come back on any of this or none of it, whichever you feel is more important. The process to decommission and store heavy weapons, military production sites, depots of weapons and tunnels is something that is highlighted in Clause 8 of this agreement. The process to decommission and store heavy weapons, military production sites, depots of weapons, and tunnels. This, again, is completely irresponsible. It is a fanciful ambition and a completely false notion. If weapons are stored anywhere inside the Gaza Strip, Hamas will raid those stores at a time of its choosing. And any force that constitutes the stabilisation force or the verification committee or anybody else will flee. That is what will happen. And a final point about this, and I know that you have rightly highlighted there's been some movement on what will be decommissioned and what won't. I remind all of our listeners, John, that of course, the vast majority of the terrible damage, carnage, and murder that took place on October 7th, that was carried out by light weapons. That was carried out by machine guns. That was carried out by sidearms. There were some shoulder-mounted rocket-propelled grenades that were fired there, but it's carried out predominantly by light weapons. And therefore, the idea that Hamas will decommission its larger arms, many of which have been destroyed by Israel anyway, to me is null and void and unimportant. So we do have a bit of a disagreement, John. What do you say to that? What do you say in other senses?
Well, thank you, Benjamin. I always love our conversations of the back and forth. I actually want to address all of it, and I'll try to do it quickly. On the first point of trust, I actually do believe, one, we're in uncharted territory. What is the Gaza Strip? It is not nation. It's not nation building. I view it as community building and stabilization, de-radicalization, just really altering something that is there are principles of what has worked in the past in any like scenario that are being applied, and I see that. But you asked, Israel is being asked to trust in the system. I actually agree with that. And I'm actually, as an American citizen, emboldened by that. Trust isn't saying trust the United Nations, it's saying trust the United States. It's called the President Trump 20-point peace plan. And if I try to remove all politics, there's a reason for that. You have this U.S. administration putting their skin in the game and actually being the glue and the trust behind it. So the answer is yes, you are being asked to trust the United States and its subsidiary personnel, not the United Nations, not this country, name the country, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, being handed the Gaza Strip and saying, you fix it. There actually is a glue behind that. So I actually do agree. And I don't want to be cynical, but to push back a little bit, if Israel wasn't willing to occupy the Gaza Strip and to take over security, governance, and services, which they're not for many reasons, and we've had that conversation, then you do have to trust. And I actually think of the scenarios that I could imagine, a UN Security Council resolution directing this operation with the United States, the only superpower on the planet, backing and mitigating, even when there is a bad plan put forward, mitigating, going, okay, we're going to step in here. What's being said, what's going to actually happen, as Israel is not being asked to take one step back until there is actual real security. And Israel, which is the paradigm shift, has the right to eliminate any threat it sees based on its intelligence. So I believe that trust is there. The second point about self-determination and statehood, I actually agree with you on this, the likelihood, but it's the word before that, path to self-determination and statehood. That is, of course, the Saudi Arabia and all other countries kind of wording requirement that, sure, a generation, whatever, in the future. But the self-determination is that Palestinian community-based leadership, all of that I believe, but I warranted. The monopoly of violence. So you talked about weapons, who controls. It is about monopoly of violence. It is very basic on who controls the majority of the monopoly of violence. As I travel the world, there are a lot of places that the state or whoever is the actual government doesn't control it. It is controlled by gangs. I wrote the article Gangs of Baghdad on how I managed going around the mob leaders and shared power, keep your area quiet. I do believe, though, even though with October 7th, the fact that 4,000 rockets, 20,000 short-range rockets were in Gaza, is a failure. And so beyond the light weapons, those 20,000 short to medium range or short range rockets, although not accurate, is not can't ever be allowed to wage. And I point you to, again, analogies are only as good as the context in which they apply. It's the principle. General Eisenhower, after victory in World War II, said it'll probably take 50 years to de-radicalize the Germans. And if you ever think that I'll give them the ability to wage war again, you're crazy. I believe that there should be such statements as it'll probably take 30 years, 40 years to de-radicalize the population in Gaza, which is actually a controlled environment outside of Judea and Samaria. And they can't have the means to wage war in any sense of the matter. And the only people who have a monopoly of violence and the arms, which will be difficult. But this is actually, I actually have optimism because of how visiting every location, you can control it. You can be the monopoly of violence and you can clear. I actually blew. Lastly, Benjamin, I view after
Wait,
visits,
John, just finish that thought. You can actually clear. You were in the middle of your sentence
yeah,
there.
you can actually clear, which is what I saw, like in starting with the easier problem for an international stabilization force to enter is you clear an area that we've talked about before called the Disneyland theory, and you do this bite by bite while Israel holds their security like they have the right to. And as the forces not in a way are clearing an area, a community is established, and then you do it what should have been done a long time ago, and you get rid of the past thinking. Although, yes, you're right as an Israeli to say, we've heard this before, we've seen this before, but actually, this is something that's never been tried. And you can clear areas, you can secure, and you can become the monopoly of violence and verify every day. Don't put a wall up and just hope for good things to happen. You can actually control a lot of this. That aspect I saw it, what's happening, and I am actually enheartened by the forward progress because I actually view one of the bigger weapons threats, not the tunnels, not the small arms, not the medium arms. I view the leftover explosives in the Gaza Strip as one of the highest. When you have IDF forces still hitting 2,000-pound bombs that are turned into IEDs, that would of course be targeted against the International Stabilization Force.
And you're talking there, John, specifically about Hamas's ability to recycle these undetonated munitions and to deploy those towards Israel and Israelis and the ISF and anybody else there.
Right, which is the scale of the work to be done, which is why that budget is so important. That it's not a big area, but the scale of the work is massive. So if I was an Israeli, I'd be like, yes, please do that work there. We're going to hold our line. We're going to kill terrorists that are trying to kill us while you work to undo 20 years of militarization and those IEDs, that explosive waging war capability, I think is one of the higher priorities. So I'm actually, again, going back to our different views of this, I want forward progress. Again, understanding if Israel's not, which it would require great sacrifices and great change in thinking. And I think, like you said, not going to happen, unlikely beyond even statehood, but even sacrificing soldiers to do what's the massive task that needs to be done. And I welcome this process with the UN, not the actual institution that to be trusted. It's the US in the process, but also with all these other actors.
So thank you, John. I want to again come back at you, and I also want, before, if people missed it at the beginning or they just sort of skipped over it, it's really important that your viewpoints are brought forward. We really value them, and the reason is because, as I know, as you know, obviously, but as others who interview know, you actually take the time to go to the venues about which you speak. And so what it is that you're saying is not informed by simply reading and studying and looking at and reviewing graphs and charts, but you're actually there on the ground. And I really appreciate that that's informing your perspective as well. And it's why I feel very comfortable promoting your viewpoints and also disagreeing where I do disagree. And I'll go into a couple of those thoughts now, if I may. Firstly, this rapidly cobbled together nonsense, which is what I described it as earlier, these memorandums of misunderstanding, these plans for disarmament, these deals of the century, these peace to prosperity outlines, they do have the fingerprints all over them of Jared Kushner, among others. And I just wonder, and I ask our listeners to ask themselves, would Jared Kushner assume the risk in his commercial dealings that he seems to be encouraging Israelis to assume time and time and time again when he talks about establishing a state for the Palestinian Arabs? I wonder if he would apply the same attitude toward risk in his own commercial dealings as he asks of the Israeli people who have had friends, families, loved ones killed and massacred by the Palestinian Arabs, specifically on October 7th and since, and who have served countless days in uniform trying to repel this threat that is still on its feet. And that notion of a threat still on its feet brings me to your point about Eisenhower. There are a lot of people who talk about a Marshall Plan and that we need to do that which was done after World War II with the Palestinian Arabs, and we need to rebuild the Gaza Strip, and we need to create apartment buildings and opportunities and so on. There's one key difference that is often overlooked. At the end of World War II, the Germans signed a note of unconditional surrender. Hamas has not signed any such thing. In fact, Hamas has repeatedly voiced its determination to show defiance and its determination to carry out future October 7ths as and when it's able to do so. In my opinion, it cannot be that the ultimate outcome of what was launched against us on October 7th is that every single Gazan gets a brand new apartment in a high-rise building that is invested into by some sort of international investment fund. To me, that makes no sense at all. In addition to that, with regard to the viability of this, the Israel Defense Forces cannot withdraw, whether this is after the decommissioning of weapons held by Hamas or prior to the decommissioning of weapons held by Hamas, because we know that there is a relentless aspect to the jihadist ideology that powers these people over there inside Gaza. Now, there are some people who have criticized me because I do differentiate between Hamas and I differentiate between Gazan civilians, but I don't absolve the civilians of Gaza because I've been given no reason to absolve them. And I'll give you an example of why I don't trust any notion that they are ever going to be de-radicalized. On October 7th, there were 3 waves of attack that came through the fence from the Gaza Strip. The first wave of attack was the Nukhba forces, essentially the elite, if you like, of Hamas. The second wave were the regulars of Hamas. The third wave was Gazan civilians who went into the kibbutzim and the communities there along the enclave that abutted the Gaza Strip and promptly looted anything and everything that they could find from those homes. These were Gazan civilians. There is not one story, not one tale, not one testimony of any Gazan civilian going into any of these Israeli communities, seeing the carnage that had taken place and applying CPR or first aid or calling an ambulance or anything of the sort. That same Gazan population applauded and cheered, and people can go back and look at the videos, when Israel's people, our elderly, our infirm, our soldiers, our dead, were dragged through the streets of Gaza on October the 7th, and that same population applauded in droves each and every time that there was a macabre release ceremony of our hostages when they were handed back to us after having languished in the tunnels of Gaza for many, many, many days. I don't believe in this notion that this people can be de-radicalized. I mean, in the state of Israel, John, and I think this is the same in the United States of America, in the state of Israel, we struggle to educate our own people as to what are the foundational principles of civics, what are the agreed upon parameters of religious teachings, religious philosophies, you name it, there's a debate about it. And somehow we're expected to go and de-radicalize this population that shows no will and no willing whatsoever to turn its face favorably toward the state and the people of Israel. With regard to the Saudis, I just will put my view forward. I do not trust the Saudi Arabian kingdom at all. They have shown that they are armed with one capability when it comes to Iran that Israel doesn't have and probably will never have, namely that they can, at one particular stage, be opposed to a regime in Iran, but they can always turn back to it and do business with it in a way that Israel cannot. The notion that we should promote normalization with the Saudis above resolving the issue of Gaza and the Palestinian Arabs there is completely false, in my opinion. That is a distant second priority normalization with the Saudis, despite all of the riches that everyone tells me will eventuate from such normalization. That is a distant second to the importance of us resolving the issue inside Gaza. And I'm going to turn it to you with something that I know that you don't agree with me on. I am still firmly of the view that the only way to bring quiet to this area is not by way of all of this nonsensical board of peace claptrap. It is by the relocation of the Gazan people en masse. Those are the negotiations that I would like to see take place. I wonder if we could conceive, for example, of a scenario wherein Israel and the Americans are sitting down and negotiating about an enclave inside the Sinai Peninsula during a discussion where the Egyptians are not brought to the table in the way that we are expected to be absent from negotiations when people discuss what the future of Israel ought to be. I wonder if we could reverse that or invert it and instead have a discussion about where the Gazans should be inside Egypt in the absence of Egyptian participation. It troubles me that no such thing is ever considered simply because Sisi, who's massively culpable for what happened on October 7th, incidentally, says that he will not accept the Gazan people. Finally, on this point, I just want to hammer home a couple of considerations before we get your response. I know that you don't agree with me on it. I know that you don't think that it's viable, and I understand why you don't think it's viable, but I think it's essential. If we look to other theaters, we see, for example, that during the Syrian civil war, which was Syrian civilians falling prey to domestic internal tyranny, the international community accepted the Syrian refugees and was applauded for doing so. Neighboring states such as Turkey and non-neighboring states such as Germany. In the example of Ukraine, which was external tyranny, external invasion by the Russians into Ukraine, we saw the international community accept Ukrainian refugees, neighboring and non-neighboring, neighboring such as Poland, non-neighboring including the state of Israel, and everybody applauded. Only in the case of the Gazans are we repeatedly told that anybody who accepts the Gazans is complicit in ethnic cleansing, in total contravention to international conventions elsewhere, as I've just delineated, and B, that the Gazans, despite the enormous suffering that's a result of their own leadership, as you said at the top of this program, that the Gazans uniquely, unlike the Syrians, unlike the Ukrainians, they don't want to go anywhere. They want to stay firmly in the rubble in which they find themselves and the discomfort in which they find themselves. And I would just say that in either of those scenarios, whether external pressure, such as Israel's defensive war and crossing into the Gaza Strip, or by the internal pressure, the internal tyranny, the domestic tyranny that we're always told the Gazans are suffering from, namely that they're under the jackboot of Hamas, in either case, there is clear international precedent. Those people are allowed to leave where they are. And I think that is the only resolution that can bring security to the state of Israel. There is no other outcome that I view with any confidence whatsoever, certainly not this agreement.
All right, Benjamin. So I'll start with the last first, as we do strongly disagree on the political feasibility of that what would be controversial in even international law. There's a difference from in conflict, temporary displacement. All the examples you gave, especially Ukraine, the civilians that were welcomed by other nations and evacuated, many of those returned to their state. So there is that aspect, but just from a political feasibility aspect, I do believe the greatest travesty that is under responsibility hasn't been even sought or accountability or the lessons learned is Egypt's closing of its border, building a new wall. You and I have discussed that. I believe it is a horrific, historic horrificness. The one nation that could have built a displaced persons camp under the United Nations. I interviewed Ambassador Dermer. He's like, sign a UN Security Council resolution that they get to come back. Thousands of civilian lives that Hamas wanted to die are on the hands of the Egyptians, in my opinion. Absolutely. And that is the difference. But once the conflict ends, then we're getting in a different territory about allowing people to leave. I actually want to end the refugee insanity that is prevalent only with the Palestinian populations, Gaza, Judea, Samaria, you name it. And that's why in this, whatever the plan is, UNRWA, in my opinion, needs to be disbanded as an organization as the single perpetrator of the continuing of a special refugee status where I agree in temporary displacements for the pursuit of preserving civilian life and the returning of them. Because if they were to move, in my opinion, Benjamin, into Egypt, not in a displaced persons camp, which is temporary, then they would again be viewed as refugees. And the cycle to me continues, but I understand we are different positions. On some of the other topics, the World War II example of basically you're right, unilateral surrender, but the scale that I think people miscomprehend, even in Japan, a strongly radicalized society, it was a functioning society, and then the unilateral surrender with the leadership saying we have being left in place, so many variations. People won't face the reality of the radicalization of this population. You mentioned it about October 7th, and I agree with you. More civilians crossed the border than actual so-called militant combatants, members of Hamas. That aspect has to be reckoned with, and the work that has to be done to do it, and why building not necessarily getting rid of this welfare society, right? So building self-dependence, which is when we talk about, we covered most of the podcast about the security concerns. Of course, that until it's resolved, I don't care if it's 1 point, it's 99% your point. There's a famous quote about this. It is Israel's number one concern. It is even the peace board's number one concern. But if you really want to get to stability to where security is alleviated, then you have to cover governance. You have to cover services. And again, I want UNRWA defunded, decommissioned, failed in every aspect to include even providing basic services and hiring Hamas to do that. You have to get into that education and labor, and who's going to do it? Who's going to start the de-radicalization of the population from from birth, the Sesame Street, all of this. You have all of these people, and I give credit to the nations that are even doing the International Stabilization Force, but all the NGOs vetted in the vetting process. This is the work. So, but lastly, I understand the Israeli, and I've seen reporting about, this won't work. It's insanity to try it. You and I have had conversations about those that said Hamas would never give the hostages back. So, in this aspect of it's just not, they won't give their weapons up. They'll never give up power. I'm not saying hold my beer, as an American would say, but I see forward progress. And the fact that for about 5 months, we didn't have any forward progress. And it was pretty much status quo. Like, okay, like we understand the scale of this task. I'm saying there is historical principles that can be applied and there are successes in a very unique context. But those that say just not possible, I think that they've already been proven wrong, as you and I said. And there is an aspect going back to it requires immense amount of will to keep at not just the security concerns, that's number one, decommissioning, but the education, fixing even the services, get them off of being a welfare society. And this is the aspect of that was perpetuated not by just those in the countries, but in the international community of that's not going to build stability or peace in any way. You got to teach them basic. And I know Israel left agriculture. There was all the vibrant aspects of that there. It was radicalized under this warped ideology that you're not going to fix. And this is the one place that I agree with you on 90% of the Saudi Arabia thing is who's going to do the de-radicalization and do it quickly. There is some work done by Saudi Arabia to fix their own radicalized problem that the principle, not cut and paste, the principles are there. So I don't mind them being a part of that personally.
So thank you, John. A couple of quick responses to that. Again, on Saudi Arabia, I think if you were to remove the Palestinian Arab threat to Israel, or certainly to remove half of that threat, namely by way of their relocation out of the Gaza Strip, if the Palestinian Arab threat was not a continuing pulsing challenge to Israel, I think that it's very, very clear that Israel is managing just fine with or without the normalization with the Saudis. And I do not want my leadership to be unduly seduced by that prospect, because that discussion, the entire discussion about normalization with the Saudis, I realize we're digressing a little bit, is punctuated by completely abnormal demands. And as I mentioned during a recent episode of the show, those abnormal demands include the Saudis coming along and dictating that Israel has to partition its capital city, Jerusalem, that we have to establish a pathway for statehood for the Palestinian Arabs. And everybody dismisses this. And everybody says, well, they just want to see some sort of lip service paid. I'm not convinced that that's true, and I don't see why they have any right to demand that we pay even lip service to an idea that is nothing short of suicidal. I don't see Israel making demands of what the Saudis ought to do domestically. In fact, I note that in the memorandum of misunderstanding between the Americans and the Iranians on the war that's going on there, there's a line in there, a clause, I'm sure you recall it, that expresses that the two parties to this negotiation will not involve themselves in domestic affairs within their respective countries. So why is Israel expected to operate by a different standard when it comes to Saudi normalization, whereby the Saudis can fill the negotiations with diktats that frankly have nothing whatsoever to do with the normalization process? Israel should reject such an idea, in my view. Again, we were doing just fine in the absence of Saudi normalization. Let us not be greedy unduly. With regard to Sisi, here's where I disagree again. I really do applaud you for having the courage to lay blame and culpability, as you have done, as a very rare voice within the discourse, at the feet of Sisi, who absolutely could have opened and designated territory for the absorption of the Gazans, so that they could be moved well away from the kinetic activities of the IDF, even though the IDF did successfully move the preponderance, the vast majority of uninvolved civilians away from those areas. They could have been in even greater safety, far away from the battlefield, if Sisi had undertaken to establish a zone for the Gazans. So thank you for saying what you've said. You are a rare voice. But despite that fact, I actually don't believe that the Gazans would simply be moved into a particular area of the Sinai Peninsula. I look at Sisi's track record. I look at Sisi, who is not a man who is prone to destabilizing forces inside Egypt, and I draw comfort from that, because we all remember when Morsi took power of the Muslim Brotherhood and started to draft a constitution, and who got rid of him? Sisi, who didn't like what he was seeing, launched a military coup and brought some degree of stabilization to Egypt. I believe that you'd see a similar degree of agency by Sisi in this case. I think what you would see is you would see the Gazans promptly moved along and dispersed throughout the continent of Africa in various different directions. And that would prevent this forming up of a perennial refugee status, as you so rightly lament, because they wouldn't be fashioned into a singular polity in the eyes of the international community, which is a completely false notion in and of itself. We all know that the Palestinian Arabs are not a singular polity. This is part of the problem. You have Hamas, you have Palestinian Islamic Jihad, you have the Palestinian Authority. They all want to kill each other, they all want to murder each other, and they all absolutely hate and detest each other. So I think adding to the number of Palestinian Arab polities would not be a bad thing, were they to be dispersed. The last thing that last 2 points, John, if I may, I don't agree that we can't talk about the relocation of the Gazans because the war is at an end. I don't think the war is at an end. I think that the war is in a lull. And I would argue that when the war is in a lull, that is the opportunity to think longer term and about long-term ramifications. That's why I want to see a policy that brings about a positive long-term outcome, such as the one that I'm advocating for. And the final point I wanted to say, and I realize I'm taking a little bit of a diversion here. I'd love your thoughts on this, though, but we all saw what happened in Quetta. I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly. Please let me know if not. The Spanish enclave there off on the northeastern side of Morocco. These tens of thousands of Moroccans breaching the area, marching in there, and guess what? Not a massive bloodbath, not the killing, raping, beheading of civilians, not the looting of homes. A great deal of consternation by the locals who lived there, a great deal of alarm by the Europeans who are now saying that they might need to tighten the freedom of movement between European countries as a result of this. But what happened there shows the distinction between a crowd moving en masse of military-aged men in the vast majority of cases, as we saw in Quetta, versus a crowd moving en masse of military-aged men with a bloodthirst to kill and murder Israelis and Jews, as we had to deal with on October 7th. In other words, John, in Israel, we're dealing with a unique type of threat, not seen in too many other places. And I think that what happened in Quetta, which didn't result in that amount of bloodletting at all or anything of the sort, shows just how depraved our enemies are.
Agree. There's some unique context to that, of course, with the whole. I mean, I think it's a different case study on you have to have secure borders. As much as the United States has to have secure borders, this ideal of greater interest of opposing groups or even people outside of, and I'm a realist. I believe in nation states. I believe in sovereign borders. I believe in consequences when you cross those borders, but this one that was unique with there was no physical barrier. Their courts ruled in something. Most of those have many, if not all of them, but a lot of those have been returned back to where they came from. So there's a lot of uniqueness there. On the comments, though, of course, there is the double standard that I rail against. Israel is held to a double standard, not just in war and warfare, but even secure borders and all that aspect that we've talked and likely talk about again. The aspect of moving the civilians away in the combat area, we violently agree. Although I will add a yes and to yes, the IDF was successful in implementing more civilian harm mitigation measures than any nation in any war in history. Moved them into a safer area, but then Hamas used those as refuge and safeguard. Whereas Mohammed Def killed, he was killed in the safe area because if you don't secure it as well, which is what, if you move them out of the main combat area, you could actually secure them, which would have alleviated Sisi's concerns because of his instability within his own country. If somebody else comes in to secure, there was an alternative there. And lastly, I agree with you on the normalization with Saudi Arabia. And I have actually heard everything from every Israeli leader, right, left, saying, not going to happen. We will secure ourselves. And that's the right of every nation without double standards, is their national security. And you can't disconnect what we're talking about in Gaza, which is what is the way ahead, with what I saw in southern Lebanon, a much greater threat, and the border situation there, where the strategic vision is unclear. But in my own words, Israel improving its security, both on its borders, but even with Iran, is a success. So yes, the way ahead with Gaza and the peace board and trust but verify, conditions based, not one step back. I fully support that, but understand all of the concerns. But Israel is safer today than it was on October 6th.
John, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the back and forth, the robust discussion. You're somebody with whom I treasure having the opportunity to converse and to discuss things of real consequence. And I know that our listeners do as well. And on that note, John, I wanted to ask you, where can people buy your latest book?
Oh, well, thank you for that, Benjamin. My latest book comes out actually in 2 weeks. 20
Okay,
times I almost died. It actually starts in Israel and ends in Israel, uniquely so. 20 times I almost died. You can get it anywhere you buy books, Amazon, Walmart, Target, Barnes and Nobles. You just search for it and you'll find it.
great stuff. All right, John, congratulations on the book. And as soon as you get a link, send it over to me because I'll put it in the show. Do you already have a link for advanced purchase?
Of course I do.
Send it to me. And for our listeners, that'll be in the show notes of this podcast. Thanks a lot, John. It was a pleasure. And I look forward to next time.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Benjamin Anthony Show, a product of the MirYam Institute. Now, listen, if you're enjoying our content on YouTube, please take a moment to hit the bell icon and to subscribe to the show. That's how you can get hold of all of our episodes as soon as they're released. Also, if you're listening on our audio podcast, subscribe at wherever it is you download your podcast from and leave a rating and review. Doing so really does help us to reach an ever wider audience. And finally, I want to hear what's on your mind. So if you've got thoughts, comments, or questions, leave them in the comments section on the YouTube channel, and I'll do my very best to get to those as soon as I can. Thanks again, and for now, it's over and out.